Okay, here we go, lecture number 3. In this lecture, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about some of the important people in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that sort of brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's why it's titled Kennedy, Castro, and Khruschev, because these three men had really the leading roles in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, if you watch a film like 13 Days, which is a film that portrays the Cuban Missile Crisis and sort of the dramatic events from particular perspective, you see in those kinds of portrayals, you'll often see Kennedy. You'll see the Kennedy White House. You'll see Bobby Kennedy. You'll see, people like Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk, and a Secretary of State, all those kinds of things. But you don't get a sense of who these other characters are. Who are the people sort of on the other side of the veil? And I think that it's really important that we have a sense of who the people on sort of either end of this conflict are. Because as this 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis plays itself out, one thing that you guys are going to hear a lot about is communication going back and forth between Washington and Moscow and Cuba and Moscow. And so who were these guys behind this communication? So the first one I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about here is Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro was introduced in the last lecture as the leader of the Cuban Revolution. He was in his early 30s. I think he was 33 when the revolution ended. Fascinatingly, as far as Fidel Castro is concerned, Fidel still maintains a really powerful significance in Cuba today. He isn't currently the leader of Cuba, although it was really just a couple years ago that he stepped down. And up until that point, he had been the longest reigning dictator anywhere in the world. And now it's his younger brother who runs Cuba. There's a term in sort of social science and political science studies, sociology, that is, in Spanish, the term is a personalismo. Someone who rules through personality. Another way to think about it is sort of a personality cult. Fidel Castro, over the years, absolutely developed this personalismo status, where he himself became the sort of center of Cuba, and Cuban identity really centered around Castro. That's one of the reasons why the transition going from Castro to his younger brother was a little bit sort of surprising, or I don't know if I would say worrisome. I think people were worried, or there was a worry whether or not Castro would be able to hold on to power, or his brother would hold on to power, because he himself had such a powerful component to sort of creating modern Cuba and what Cuba was today, or what it is today, rather. So, but going back, Castro is a very smart man. It would be foolish to say that Castro was just this sort of, like crazy dictator. And he is kind of portrayed like that sometimes. But he was a very smart man, and in many ways ruled Cuba from a position of thoughtfulness. You don't have to agree with the way he ruled, but he certainly was a man with a philosophy, with an idea, and was very passionate about those ideas. So Castro comes into power, and as we mentioned in the last lecture, he really was sort of snubbed by the United States. Eisenhower refuses to meet with him at the UN, and putting yourself sort of in Castro's position at that point, I mean, first of all, it was a huge insult to Castro that Eisenhower would not meet with him. And he was angry, as you can, sort of potentially imagine. And so into this picture at the UN, Castro's angry. There's probably a certain amount of embarrassment. He went to the United Nations to actually, get credibility for his revolution and for his new country, and he gets snubbed by the United States. Now, of course, remember, Castro had been nationalizing all kinds of industry, all kinds of land, and so the United States had good reason to be angry from an economic perspective, because billions of dollars worth of American assets had been nationalized by the Cuban government, the new Cuban government, and even more were going to be nationalized in the coming years. So as Castro is at this meeting at the UN, into this picture comes this guy. And this picture I love because I really feel like it gives you a sense of the mood of this relationship, especially the initial pairing of these two. And in this photograph, this little bald-headed man who looks to be quite an adorable character, but who we'll find out soon is definitely not all soft and smiley. This man is Nikita Khruschev, and Nikita Khruschev was the leader of the Soviet Union. He took over after Stalin, and think about the circumstances in which he's taking over. He's taking over the post-purge, post-Stalinist era Soviet Union, and he himself was a hardliner. I think it would be false to suggest that he was sort of soft-hearted. But he has this sort of funny image because in the United States memory, many Americans alive at the time remember him. He actually made an official visit to the United States in the was it in the 50s? Yeah, it was during the Eisenhower administration, and he visited Disneyland, and he wore a Bermuda short and shirt and like a straw hat, and he looks like this kind of typical tourist at Disneyland. And yet this is a man who took his shoe off in front of the international community and banged it on a desk and said, "We will crush you," meaning we will crush you, the United States. He was a fierce cold warrior as well. But in this photo, you see him embracing Castro, because who comes into the picture when the United States won't meet with Fidel but Nikita Khruschev? And I always pause here because think about the critical nature of this move. Prior to this, Castro had not expressed any connection or desire to be connected with the Soviet Union. He had not made any specific overtures about turning Cuba into a socialist nation, into a communist nation. The revolution itself was socialist, but remember, those two concepts are not necessarily married to each other. You could have a socialist economy and a democratic government. I mean, Scandinavia has quite a strong flow of both of those concepts. But the Chinese, at the same time, have a capitalist economy and a communist government. So we do typically think of communism and socialism as being married, but they don't have to be. And in the case of Cuba in the early 1960s, late 1950s, they were not officially a communist nation, and they were not connected to the Soviet Union. So if you think back to that map that we had in the very first lecture with all the different colored countries on it and who was allied with who, the Soviet Union and Cuba had not yet allied with one another in 1959. But when Eisenhower refused to meet with Castro, he essentially pushed Castro into Khrushchev's waiting arms. And Khrushchev immediately says, "Don't worry about it, we'll trade with you," because the United States was saying they would not trade with Cuba. There was an embargo. We would no longer purchase sugar from Cuba. We would no longer be selling goods to Cuba. I mean, we were essentially cutting Cuba off. And so the Soviets not only reach out a hand to Cuba to help them, but they put their arms around Cuba. And mix into this the fact that the Eisenhower and then the next administration, the Kennedy administration, begins a series of assassination attempts. So Castro it is literally being hunted by the U.S. government. The U.S. government did all kinds of, sometimes it's hard for Americans to believe that their government does things like this, or perhaps it isn't so hard for us to believe that our government does things like this. But just a series of attempts were made on Castro's life. One of the most famous was Fidel Castro being sent a box of exploding cigars. Just kind of sounds like a cartoon, but this was the CIA in an attempt to assassinate Castro. Poisoned cigars were also used. And none of this is a secret. This is all part of, open CIA records. Many former CIA operatives have written books. There's been, countless pieces of historical work done on this issue. And yes, many, many attempts were made on Castro's life, and Castro knew it. So not only is the United States now kind of putting a hand up to Castro and saying, we don't want anything to do with you, but we're also trying to kill him, literally trying to kill him. And into this picture comes Khruschev, and within a matter of just a couple of years, Fidel Castro officially calls the Cuban Revolution a communist revolution. And Cuba becomes communist, and it becomes a communist ally of the USSR. I always say historians are smug because, we go, well, that was super stupid. Why didn't Eisenhower just meet with him? But I'm smug because I have hindsight, because I can look back and say that was a critical error. If we had extended an olive branch to Castro, potentially worked with him, perhaps all of this could have been avoided. But in the times, especially thinking about if you wanted to get elected President of the United States or remain elected President of the United States in the early 1960s, late 1950s, or really any time throughout the entire Cold War, you had to be strongly anti-communist. You had to be a fierce Cold Warrior. And so any kind of overture of support of Cuba would have been political suicide. And so, like I said, historians are smug because we say, well, if only Eisenhower had met with him. But you remember in 1959, there's a political campaign going on, and the Republicans want to hold on to the White House. And who's running but Richard Nixon, the vice president under Eisenhower? And so Eisenhower needed to pave a path for Nixon that was, and Nixon already had a really strong communist or anti-communist record. So to make any kind of moves to appease Hitler, I'm sorry, not Hitler, that comes in a second, to appease Castro would have been political suicide at this point. So as I mentioned, there is this election. And who is elected but not Mr. Nixon, but a young man who ultimately is the youngest president elected, still remains the youngest president ever elected. President Barack Obama, I think a student of mine looked it up a couple days ago, and I think Barack Obama is like the 5th youngest president ever elected. So Kennedy was even quite a bit younger than President Obama. And Kennedy comes into the White House in 1960, and we see the Kennedy administration now sort of pick up this Cuba situation and have to deal with it. So let's talk about Kennedy and who he was, and kind of get some understanding of the Kennedy White House and how it's going to be affected by the Cuban Missile Crisis. So John F. Kennedy. So here's your screen with John F. Kennedy and his family, and I'm looking at it right now. And you'll see on there, first of all, a little bit of background on John Kennedy before we talk about, Cuba and all those kinds of things. I always think knowing a little bit about a president's past and where he comes from can really inform us as to not only how they got into the position that they were in, but also potentially how others perceived them and how they are going to do some decision making. The top photograph that you see there is actually a photo of the Kennedy family. And in the far left, the man seated to the far left is Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy is the father of the Kennedy clan, and he himself, in his own right, was quite famous. Joe Kennedy became extremely wealthy during the 1920s, in the 19-teens, in stock market speculating. He amassed massive amounts of wealth in much of the same way that the other stock market tycoons amassed their wealth. He amassed it by manipulating the stock market. And then, luckily for the Kennedy family, but not so luckily for millions of other Americans, Joe Kennedy pulled his money out right before the crash and was able to actually save his family's fortune. Now, when I say fortune, I heard this story one time, and this gives a sense of how wealthy the Kennedys were. The Kennedys were so wealthy that Robert Kennedy, the second to the youngest son, he's actually standing in the photograph with his arm leaning against the mantle of the fireplace with quite a nice white suit on there. So he's a little boy there, and about at that age, he got a paper route. But unlike most little boys who deliver their paper route on a bike, Robert Kennedy delivered his papers, so the story goes, you have to research this and check it out for yourself, but the story goes from the back seat of a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce limousine. That is how wealthy the Kennedys were. They were East Coast elites, and so powerful, in fact, was Joe Kennedy during the stock market, 1920 stock market boom, that when the stock market crashed, President Roosevelt actually gave Joe Kennedy a commission to work on the committee, the congressional committee that was going to rewrite the rules of the stock market, because who better to rewrite the rules than the people that had manipulated it to begin with? Well, from there, Joe Kennedy launches himself into even more political power and political position. And the reason that this is important is because Joe Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy, is going to have a huge impact on John Kennedy's presidency and really how his legacy is seen. But Joe Kennedy himself is going to stumble pretty significantly early in his political career, such that he is not ultimately going to run for president, although that was his dream. It was his dream to run for president and to become president. But when he makes a huge political blunder, his dreams for running for the presidency turn to his sons. And I'm going to just point out his sons for you here. And, you know, all due respect to the women of the Kennedy family, they have done some amazing things. In fact, one of the Kennedy sisters and her children were the ones that started the Special Olympics. These are some pretty important and influential people in 20th century America and in even modern America. Sorry, the furnace is kicking on, so it's a little noisy down here. I'm trying to go to the quietest place in my house, and it turns out it's not quite so quiet. Anyway, back to the story of the Kennedys. My life not quite so glamorous as the Kennedys, I guess. So the Kennedys were, you know, really influential, the women influential, but this is not a lecture to talk about the women Kennedys. I'm going to focus on the men in the Kennedy family. So seated in this picture, or standing in this picture, you see, actually, count them with me, 1, 2, 3, 4 boys, and then their father, the fifth man of the Kennedy family. So I've already pointed out Joe Kennedy, the father, and Robert Kennedy, who is the second to the youngest son. But the oldest son in the Kennedy family is actually standing next to the oldest sister, or he's seated next to his oldest sister. And if you look all the way to the right, there is a dashing young man in a suit seated just behind his mother, who is in a chair. That is Joe Jr. Joe Jr. was the oldest son in the Kennedy family, and he was his father's first choice to be tapped to run and to become sort of the inheritor of his father's political hopes and dreams. Unfortunately for the Kennedys, and tragically, Joe Kennedy died in World War II. He was a pilot who was shot down and killed. So next in line is the second son of the Kennedy family, and that is John. And John is standing in the background next to the curtains. You'll see him just standing next to the fireplace mantle in front of the curtains. And that's John Kennedy. That's the future president, who is also pictured just below with his wife, Jacqueline. I've already pointed out Bobby Kennedy, who's got his arm leaning up against the fireplace mantle in that white suit. But the last of the Kennedy sons, and who most recently passed away, but who also had quite a political future, and so too did Bobby. We're going to talk about Bobby, the guy leaning against the fireplace mantle, who had himself a run for the presidency and quite a famous stint as the Attorney General in the Kennedy White House. But Teddy Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy is seated. He's the little one in the little sailor suit down there in front of his mother. And Ted Kennedy had the longest political career of all of the Kennedys. And in some ways, perhaps the most influential, although maybe for you guys the least well known of the political careers. So while Joe himself did not run for president, and while Jack, or John, you can say both, lost his life early, so too did Bobby lose his life early, both of them to assassins' bullets. So kind of a tragic legacy, but also a really important legacy, so it's just kind of a fascinating family system. But what I said to you was that the reason that Joe pushed his sons into politics was because he made this huge personal political error. And here's what happened. Joe Kennedy was tapped to be ambassador to England during the mid-1930s. And he happened to be there while Hitler was on the march across Europe. In the early days, Americans often think World War II started in 1940 when we entered. But that's not true. In fact, World War II had been going on for many years. It's kind of a point that sometimes if you talk to the British or, other Europeans, they'll kind of politely mention that the Americans arrived a bit late to the fight. And we did, in fact. And so prior to the U.S. involvement, Europeans were fighting and were concerned about Hitler. Hitler had marched into Austria, into Poland. I mean, this was a man who, Czechoslovakia. But unfortunately for Joe Kennedy, along with the Prime Minister of England, he made a very critical error in that he met, as representing the United States as the U.S. ambassador, he met with Hitler, along with Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, and agreed to allow Hitler a certain, the word might be latitude, in taking over and marching into sovereign nations within Europe, as long as Hitler promised not to, just don't go any further. I mean, we'll let this slide if you just don't go any further. This was called, and Joe Kennedy was absolutely bashed, especially because Hitler did not hold to this promise. They have this really famous meeting. There's lots of pictures of Joe Kennedy shaking hands with Hitler, and then Hitler turns right around, marches into Czechoslovakia, marches into Poland, breaking the agreement that he had made, and people said, what a fool Joe Kennedy was, what a fool, and instead of taking the opportunity to put Hitler in his place when he could have, he appeased him. He sort of, just tried to pat him on the head and make him happy, and he was seen as incredibly weak and politically just a huge, huge failure. The reason why this is important is because Jack Kennedy is going to have to live with his father's legacy throughout his political career, and he is ultimately going to be kind of criticized because people felt that he too was going to was an appeaser. And when we see the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis unfold, you'll see why that becomes, I think, really obvious, like a kind of a critical issue and a concern that John Kennedy himself maintains throughout his political life. But aside from that, John Kennedy is elected, although, his image was huge and really, really important to that election in 1960. In one famous episode, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, who was running for the Republicans, John Kennedy ran for the Democrats, they engaged in the very first live television presidential debate. So the first of its kind for the 1960 election. And the fascinating part of this is, if you listen to it on the radio, which many, many Americans did, because a lot of people still did not have televisions, weren't accustomed to really getting their political or other news from television. So many people listened on the radio. If you listened on the radio, people thought Nixon won when they did polling. But if you watched it on TV, people thought Kennedy won. And it really tells us a lot about the power of image. And Kennedy's image was nothing but glamorous. It was absolutely, people even called it sort of Camelot, our young king. his really gorgeous, glamorous wife, Jacqueline Bouvier, who was raised for part of her life in France. She was a fashionista. She was a trendsetter. So pretty impressive and really mixed relationship that this guy has, both with his advisors, with the public, and with his family and his past. So those are the men that are really kind of involved here in this series of events. But I want to talk to you about this notion of, I kind of want to get a couple of vocabulary concepts laid out here. Because one thing I want you to know is what a proxy war is. On the next screen, you'll see a political cartoon that was created in the early 1960s in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the cartoon is of Nikita Khruschev and Kennedy arm wrestling while Kennedy's finger just hovers on the button, as does Khrushchev's. And both of them are sitting on H-bombs, right? Sitting on nuclear bombs. Well, a proxy war, by definition, is a war fought between two parties, but fought in a third location, essentially allowing those two parties to have a fight, but for it to be over sort of a third place, a third idea, so that they don't have to directly confront each other. The way that proxy wars come about most often is that, if you have two people who don't want to really specifically confront their issues with each other, or two nations that don't want to, because it's so dangerous. I mean, in this case, it was incredibly dangerous. If the Americans and the Russians had literally gone toe-to-toe, the chances of us coming to nuclear war would have been extraordinary. And so the idea of fighting a proxy war, and we did it constantly throughout the Cold War. I mean, Cuba's just one example. Proxy wars were fought all over the place. We fought proxy wars in Grenada in the 1980s. We fought proxy wars in Berlin, which we've already studied, in places like Angola. There were, we could list dozens of them, not to mention Central America, which, was just boiling with war, and much of that was proxy war throughout the Cold War, because the United States and the Soviet Union never actually came to blows. We were just consistently fighting these wars over third parties in third places. So that's what Cuba becomes. It becomes this proxy war. But the other term I want to talk about is something called mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction, or often called MAD. One of the reasons why a proxy war would have been so disastrous was because of mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction is essentially, I have a gun pointed to your head with a bullet in the chamber. You have a gun pointed at my head with a bullet in the chamber. Both of us have our fingers on the trigger. In that situation, nobody can win. Nobody can win. Perhaps the best illustration of this is one of my favorite Calvin and Hobbes cartoons, where, and you should see it on the screen now, where, Calvin sort of plays out this this idea of mutually assured destruction, and, the author makes a comment on war more generally. But if you read this cartoon, hopefully you get a sense of what mutually assured destruction is really about. So I'll just be quiet for a second and let you read it. So in that screen where you see, the whap whap, that's the outcome of mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union and the U.S. had enormous amounts of nuclear weapons pointed at each other throughout the Cold War. This map that you're seeing is a list of nuclear nations in 2004. I should update it, although it's essentially remained the same. But when the United States and the Soviet Union had literally tens of thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, there was no way that a war between these two nations could come out in any other way except for total devastation. total destruction. We were both mutually assured that we would be destroyed. And so fighting proxy wars really becomes the only way that the U.S. and the Soviet Union can, sort of safely battle this Cold War. Although safety is a relative term here, because if you were living in Nicaragua, you might not have considered it a safe war. If you were living in a place like Berlin, it certainly didn't feel like a safe situation. The last thing I want to talk about here in this lecture is, and it deals with this last screen, and this is a photograph of John Kennedy once he entered the White House. This is a picture of him with his military advisors. These military advisors are going to become really important in not only the Kennedy White House, but they're important really in any president's White House. This is a group of men who are part of something called the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Any president coming in has a certain amount of appointed staff and a certain amount of staff who come from other institutions, sort of, either elected or chosen by other institutions. And the military is an institution that, while the commander-in-chief ultimately commands the military, they have a certain amount of autonomy in terms of, their ability to appoint people to this panel called the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff are essentially the highest ranking advisors, military advisors, to the president. And their job is to advise the president and to tell him, here's from the Marines' perspective, here's what we think. Or, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, they all have an advisory role. And they essentially come together as a joint committee and advise the president. Now, I mentioned just a bit ago about, Kennedy's father having this reputation for appeasing Hitler. These Joint Chiefs were Cold Warriors. These guys were Korea veterans, many of them. Many of them were World War II veterans. They had, stood a post in Berlin, kind of nose to nose with the Soviets. These guys believed in the depths of their hearts that Kennan was right. That if this disease of communism spread, that the United States would be ruined. And they truly saw themselves as needing to protect the American people, the American way of life. And in many ways, they did, and that was exactly their function. But they were extremely concerned about this new president coming in because his father, Joe Kennedy, was this, sort of soft on Hitler, appeased Hitler guy. And here is this young man. I mean, think about it. He's the youngest president ever elected. And also, John Kennedy did not have a long political career, although he had been in the military and had fought with valor. He was injured during his service. He was not considered sort of one of them. He was this kind of rich kid whose dad was an appeaser. And into the Kennedy White House comes this Joint Chiefs who begin advising Kennedy on a plan. I already mentioned that the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, was taking steps to attempt to assassinate Mr. Castro. But, and they continued to do that, and Kennedy supported these plans. The Army, the CIA, their plans were supported by the Kennedy White House. But it was a plan to invade Cuba that not long after coming into the White House, Kennedy sits down and has a meeting about this invasion plan that really becomes the first major crisis, major issue of the Cold War and the Cuba issue during the Kennedy White House. And it also becomes the first major rip in the relationship between Kennedy and his military advisors. So we're going to talk about that, which is the Bay of Pigs, this Bay of Pigs incident. I'm going to talk about that and focus on that in the next lecture. Okay? Thanks, guys.